of a rare disease of the connective tissues.
Yeah.
Another proof. See?
Great.
It relates back. It relates back in a way that proves my dad was there. It's so obscure. It's so esoteric, yet it's so consistent with that medical diagnosis. Now, then I began to branch out both before I went to Gettysburg and during. So here's what I found out about the people that I met. The man who helped me was later identified as a Gettysburg cobbler in the historical literature named John Lawrence Burns. John Lawrence Burns wasn't 70, as I had said before I identified him as biographically. What do you know? He was 69 at the time that I ran into him. He was going to turn 70 later. I had described how he had voluntarily helped me. Well, guess what? He had volunteered himself into the War of 1812 as an adolescent, and he had volunteered himself into the Battle of Gettysburg as a Union sharpshooter who got injured at age 69. So he had a spirit of volunteerism and compassion for others. As the battle went through and past his town, he picked up his rifle and volunteered into the Irish Brigade, which was one of the regimental names of the Union forces that fought at Gettysburg, and was wounded in the hip, the very leg that I had said, it looked like he had been recently wounded in the hip and was hobbled on a bad hip, such as when somebody gets arthritis of the hip joint and needs a replacement. I said he was really hobbled on that whole leg, but from the hip area because he was swinging his midsection when he was walking. I described his appearance, and what do you know? He does kind of look like RFK might have looked if he had lived to age 70. And we've identified him as the cobbler of working at that store. Now, here's what's really fascinating. I had described how he had walked up onto the sidewalk in the early morning. Again, that's significant. And what I found on my trip to Gettysburg, that he was not only the cobbler for that shop, but he was the town constable. And both back when he was the town constable, basically policeman, voluntary policeman, in Emmitsburg and also in Gettysburg, he was in the habit of doing these morning rounds where, like, he might pick up a drunk and walk him home, or pick up a lost kitten and bring it to the owner, or pick up a child who had half run from home in the middle of the night and taken back to their parents' house, and so forth. And I found that he was such a volunteer that he actually adopted the illegitimate daughter of a woman who spent her whole adult life in the almshouse in Gettysburg because she was too disinterested in working and earning a living for herself. And she was reviled in Gettysburg, which was an industrial town. It was an industrial, rural Pennsylvania crossroads kind of busy metropole. So this woman was disavowed by others in town, but John Lawrence Burns, the man who I said had helped me, and then I identified photographically, was such a humanitarian that he adopted the most unpopular, unfortunate young person in the whole town. Amazing. And then I investigated the woman who had come into the shop. I identified the shop owner as the town council president and attorney, David Kendallhart. He was the shoemaker, and John Lawrence Burns was his cobbler, which meant that David Kendallhart, the more distinguished member of Gettysburg society, was making new shoes, and John Lawrence Burns was fixing old shoes. And this is data that I collected in Gettysburg, so that makes sense why he took me to the back of David Kendallhart's millinery shop and dug into the old shoes, because those were the shoes that he was responsible for fixing. And check this out. I identified the wife of David Kendallhart, the known owner of that shop. I went to that same shop, and I found out that his wife, in a very modern way, kept her maiden name. Her name was Eliza Ann Bowen. And as I dug into the couple, David Kendallhart and his wife, Eliza Ann Bowen, thinking that she was being covetous of their goods, and that's why she had chastised Mr. Burns for giving me the free pair of old shoes and the jacket, I found out, and I actually got choked up when I found this out. They were the Gettysburg leaders of that outpost, that way station of the Underground Railroad.
Oh, wow.
Oh, I see.
I found out that, you may recall from when I first spoke about this, that at the time that Eliza Ann Bowen, that basically the proprietress or the wife of the proprietor, let's say, of the shop. We don't really know. But she clearly would have been sharing her husband's duties because he was a lawyer and town council president. So it made sense for her to be coming into the shop early in the morning. Maybe he was in court. Maybe he was in court or in a town council meeting about making up, amends about the Confederate troops stealing their bank's money and billeting their soldiers in their living rooms and stuff. What I had said was I thought she was chastising him for giving me the shoes and the jacket because I had a time dilation, an acceleration effect that was slowing up and then rapidly speeding up their speech. So I missed almost everything that the proprietor said to Mr. Burns when he was helping me get the shoes. But what I found out in the trip in October of last year, of 2013, is because they were literally the Gettysburg members of the Underground Railroad, literally harboring fugitive slaves probably in their own basements. She was probably saying, look, John, you can't give these jackets and shoes away to any little unaccompanied carpetbagger who comes through town. That was a bugle boy. He could have found a Union regiment and gotten shoes and a jacket. You gave him a good jacket and a wearable pair of shoes. What are we going to give our escaped slaves? And I got choked up about how John Lawrence Burns was so compassionate that he equipped me from the cold morning air, even though it might have meant taking a jacket and a pair of old men's shoes from somebody who had just escaped north to freedom. Mm-hmm. And how I had completely misapprehended what Eliza Ann Bowen must have been saying to John Lawrence Burns when he was bending over stuffing packing paper into the tips of those shoes. Okay, so it was really emotional. I went back there and I found out who those persons are.
Heroes.
Abolitionists. They were abolitionist heroes. And I was given a pair of shoes and a jacket from the back of their store. What a historical privilege. So I went to their gravestone. They have a joint gravestone. It's actually a monument in Evergreen Cemetery, the civilian cemetery from which Lincoln gave the Gettysburg Address. And I laid 2 roses on it. Sorry, I'm choked up.
Yeah.
This was a very emotional trip for me. I went to a floral shop and I got 2 roses and I laid it at their tombstone. It's like a spire. It's one of those old-fashioned spired tombstones.
Oh, yeah.
Just to memorialize their service to humanity in the Underground Railroad. And look at the man who helped me. He was a man who had adopted the most unpopular quasi-orphan, street urchin. The woman was doing nothing. Her mother had her out of wedlock and was doing nothing to support her daughter. And John Lawrence Burns adopted that girl and treated her as his daughter for the rest of his life. Talk about salt of the earth. So that's why I'm getting choked up now. I realize the people who equipped me when I was a young 10-year-old time traveler 109 years from the future, and I was so cold when I walked into their small rural Pennsylvania crossroads town that my teeth were chattering uncontrollably when John Lawrence Burns confronted me, that's was the nature of the people who had helped me. And from there, I then went. Yeah.
It's not an accident; it's a synchronicity.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then I didn't get so worked up about this because some of these things had been proved beforehand. But that issue of synchronicity leads me into the 2 synchronicities we know about my trip to Gettysburg in 1863. The first is that my fellow U.S. chrononaut William B. Stillings, in real time, who's my friend today, he is the great nephew of Josephine Cobb. His mother is Gail Cobb Stillings, the niece of Josephine Cobb, the photo analyst at the Library of Congress, who found the picture with Lincoln in the back of it, that in all likelihood, I believe, and I think based on my eyewitness sighting, was taken by the famed Civil War photograph Matthew Brady, as we've covered. But the first synchronicity we knew about is how is it that later in 1980, the great nephew of Josephine Cobb is selected as one of my fellow chrononauts in the CIA's Mars Jumper program. That was the first synchronicity. And of all the people I worked with over the years, Brett, as we call William Brett Stillings, was one of the people who took a great interest in the Josephine Cobb image and helped analyze it and showed that the head and shoulders of the boy in that photograph directly correspond to my 6th grade photograph, which was taken in September of 72, literally 4 months after I was sent to Gettysburg. So Brett did the proof where he did the overlays between my 6th grade portrait and how I had been photographed in Gettysburg in 1863 at a time when I was completing the 5th grade in New Jersey.
You know,
The
if you,
other
have a
synchronicity,
dentist, if you have a dentist that took a picture of you when you were that age, we can also identify the teeth from that picture, because everybody's teeth are unique. For one thing for sure is that the canines are way larger in a small child than an adult person. It'd be fascinating to get your dental stuff.
I might be able to have it. My brother's a dentist. I'm going to see him tomorrow. And yes, we could do an overlay with that. Brett's done the overlay with the outline of my head, and the shoulders they're not just similar. If you drew a line around that 6th grade portrait and then you reduced it down size-wise, it directly lays over the outline of my shoulders and head in the Josephine Cobb image.
Great.
The second synchronicity I'm happy to announce on your show because it relates to Janet and her lineage. What I was holding in the Josephine Cobb image that the great nephew of one of my fellow chrononauts would discover is a cylindrical shaped object. What it was a letter that my dad's staff back in Project Pegasus, back in the present, 1972, had written to Lincoln's Secretary of the Navy, a man by the name of Gideon Wells, W-E-L-L-E-S. It was a letter directing the Navy, and especially Secretary Wells, if he received the letter, it was passed on to him because it was addressed to him, to, without question, give me aid and assistance in the field if I ever needed it, if I was lost, hungry, stranded, etc. Because there was a concern that by sending me physically to Gettysburg via plasma confinement, we were actually really appearing there physically. I was experiencing cold, my teeth were chattering. I was experiencing getting hungry. I was experiencing getting hot under the Union parka after the sun came out and it was getting warmer that November day towards noon. I felt that I was perspiring under the jacket, and I really was perspiring under the jacket. As evidence of that, the cylinder of paper in my hand was starting to get soggy because I was just holding a piece of paper in my perspiring palm. Mm-hmm. So the synchronicity of that was Gideon Wells was supposed to give me aid and assistance in the field if I needed it. And I didn't utilize that help because I transitioned back to 1972 before I got into any more trouble than the conspicuousness of the 3 encounters I had in front of the dais. Well, then go forward to 2011 when I had traveled to the island of Maui and I had an accommodation there that broke down because I had an altercation with the mother of the residence where I was staying, just basically an argument that caused me not to be welcome there at that place. And I had just been friended on Facebook 2 days earlier by Janet. Mm-hmm. And Janet, would you like to tell your listening audience who you're the direct lineal descendant of?
Gideon Wells.
You have to understand that Gideon Wells was responsible for saving the Union because Meade was doing nothing, and Gideon kept the Confederates back with his ships.
And the other thing I found out is my house that I grew up in, we found a deed going back to 1840, so we're not sure exactly when it was built. It was a transfer. But underneath the basement are all these tunnels, and it was part of the Underground Railroad.
Where they hid people.
Right. So here's another person implicated in the scenario who was connected literally to abolition. And here's an additional one I found. It doesn't relate to my story, but I never heard it in junior high, high school, or college. And that is that when Mark Twain, the author known as Mark Twain, Samuel Langhorne Clemens, was 33, and he fell in love with and married Olivia Langdon, who he met at a dinner party when he was lecturing in Palmyra, New York, when his book Innocents Abroad came out about his journey to the Holy Land. She was the daughter of a man by the name of Jervis Langdon, who was the abolitionist who was the patron and mentor of none other than Frederick Douglass.
Wow.
So when we consider